This may not go too well simply because I kind of have a throat problem today. Last night I was trying to sleep. That damn woman stole my bed sheets. She ripped them off me. It's too hot for that bed sheets. And it has the fucking fan on. And the room is cold as hell. It's like 50 degrees outside. It's a shitty summer in New York. And that fan is blowing cold air. Long story short, I'm laying there with nothing more than like a towel covering my ass, shivering, freezing cold. Now my throat's all messed up. And she knows I do voiceovers for this sort of stuff, but she don't give a shit. Nobody gives a shit to respect the man, the main man, Lobo. Nobody cares about DC Comics references. Anyway, I thought I'd do a video on repainting a graphics card because I was interested to see how the paint I use would fare on a plastic graphics card. I will say that in this instance it was a huge mistake going about it the way that I seen slight suggestions on handling already sort of finished plastics such as this. I will say that in starting this, I would strongly suggest that someone use around 450, 425 or something grit sandpaper. 600 is not abrasive enough for the primer I use to bond to this. Also, I know there could have been other methods I took. Wendell suggested using what the hell was it again? He told me a vinyl paint or something like that. You can get it from AutoZone, which is cool and all, but I wanted to make this graphics card pearl white, and pearl white is a 3-stage paint. One of my favorite 3-stage paints. The other one is candy red. I should probably throw up a photo of candy red, but you know what candy red is. Google it. See like a candy red Yamaha motorcycle or a candy red car. Beautiful color with the metal flaking and everything. And I don't think that can be recreated with something as simple as a fucking vinyl paint. Nothing personal to the people who took that road, but I wanted a bit more jump, a little bit more pizzazz of the paint. The removal of the graphics card shroud is simple enough. You have a small screwdriver set, in which most people who mess with PCs on the regular, such as myself, you probably already have one. I will say, while looking inside of this EVGA 770 2GB, I found it to be quite beautiful. The next thing I wanted to show off is taping off the work area. Now, I went about this the lazy way. I would suggest that you take off the metal piece, the EVGA sign. The other little knickknacks, those 3 little silver bits that are in there, I don't know how you get them out. I didn't even bother. I didn't even attempt because I figured it'd be a pain in the ass. I also wasn't quite sure if the glue I had on hand would be good for plastics. In the sense of, if this graphics card, which it does get hot, it runs at averaging 80 C. Full load, 80 C. Sometimes it'll go down to 79 C for like a split second, but 9 times out of 10 it's 80 C. You notice my effed up little tape right here. It's detailing tape to get those little cracks and crevices. The really mangled up one I got from a friend who used to own a shop, Capital Customs or something like that. His name was Eric. Cool dude. I should send him a message. I haven't spoken to him in weeks. Anyway, he gave that to me. And unfortunately, in my drawer with the rest of my paints and stuff, I guess it got warm in there or something, and it's all mangled and fucked looking. The other one that looks like it's in perfect shape, it isn't worth using. I did attempt to take off this metal piece. Like, if it came off easily enough, I would have said, so be it, good to go, thank God. Instead, it wanted to fight me. And like I said before, I'm not quite sure what sort of glue I could use that would hold that in place while also not eating through the glue or messing with the structural integrity. Simply because some of the glue I have is like PVC plastic base, and the way it bonds things together is it takes 2 plastics and melts them. And I'm not even sure if this metal piece is genuinely like a little piece of aluminum or if it's like a nicely painted piece of plastic. I just said to hell with it, just gonna skip that and be lazy with it. The green masking tape I'm using for this project is I don't know the name of it. It's from 3mm, obviously, but here's the thing. This is the rice paper version. If you're going to use any sort of masking tape, I would strongly suggest getting the rice paper version. It is the best, the easiest to work with. All the other masking tape you get from Walmart is that cheap bullshit. Really isn't worth your time, energy, or even the money. Like, this right here is the bee's knees in my personal opinion. Also, you can tell by looking at it, it's very thin. You can see through it easily enough. Interesting. And that's how you know it's rice paper. Rice paper is very thin, yet fairly durable. Did you know that there's rice paper candy? If you ever feel like trying it, look for some White Rabbit candy from China. It's pretty good. And the paper they use, which is rice paper for the candy, you can eat that shit too. It's crazy. You fucking weeb. Basically, now I'm moving on to the cutting of the masking tape. You know how that shit works. It's no big whoop. There's nothing I can really explain to you other than make sure you have an X-Acto knife and make sure you have a brand new one. Mine is old, the blade is dull, so the cuts are not up to par, which means I have to do it repeatedly. After that's all done and dusted, we can now finally move on to some other part. But first I have to show you how clean it looks. Don't worry, I'll mess it up later. Once you start sanding, you're obviously going to lose the GeForce NVIDIA lettering. If you planned ahead, you probably had some vinyl company type it up for you. If not, you don't really care, neither do I. I was also looking at the bottom half thinking about how I wanted to approach that. And now that it's just hit me, watch this video again, maybe I'll like draw in the gold there. Because I have some gold enamel paint just lying around. It shouldn't be too hard to recreate that. For the strip, we repeat the same process on the EVGA huge logo. I did for a second attempt to use the blue detailing tape, but that didn't go well, so I'm editing that out. I also thought it would be prudent to mask off the inner area of the graphics card because there's no need to paint the inside. It's not visible, it doesn't matter. And also, I wasn't sure if it would increase thermal temperatures because this is thick paint. It's going to be at least 4 layers or 5 layers of paint. Probably more now that I think back at it. So I assume I'd leave that all for the outside and add nothing to the inside whatsoever. I didn't even want like debris getting on the inside of here. You know, like sometimes when working with spray paints, there's a bit of a mist, and if there isn't anywhere masked off, then that mist just sort of clings to anything like a fine dust, and it's a real pain in the fucking dick hole, especially if you get it on any area you don't want it, including inside of your house if you didn't mask off the area of plastic bags correctly. Don't ask me how I know. Once we've completed masking off all the areas that mattered, all the spots we don't want painted, everything in between, don't even bother paying attention to the little blue strips that I added. They were completely worthless. It all moved. They are only viable on flat surfaces. Anything with like an indented curve, I seem to fuck up on. But then again, it's the first time I've actually tried this on an indented curvature or slope design ever. Everything has always been a flat surface or decreasing or increasing radius that wasn't too abrupt or jarring. Real weird for me to explain it because I'm not like a paint master, and I'm talking almost in like motorcycle terms of increasing and decreasing radius turns. You forget it. Let's move on to the sandpapering. Like I said in the beginning of the video, what I want you to do here in this instance, if you're working with a graphics card like this, is to probably use something more abrasive. Here I use 600 grit. I would suggest around 400 grit or so at the least, so that way if you're using primer, then you can really get into this and actually have the primer stick to the surface. In most cases, some people would use what was it, that plastic adhesive or plastic primer where you spray it on a plastic surface and it already makes it ready for primer. I didn't have that on hand. I was using what I had on hand. This is like a project of me testing out what would happen out of my own, one, idle interest, and two, wanting the graphics card to match the rest of the computer it was going into. This is more or less a test for me to see what exactly would happen. A learning experience, really. And from my mistakes here, you will also learn something and move on to bigger and better things. Or not make the same sort of mistakes I made. So once again, now we want to make sure that we grab every area possible. You want to get every single possible edge, every corner, everywhere. Because anywhere that you undersand will be affected negatively here. It'll just look like ass, or later on in the video. Sanding particularly, you want to go in a cross pattern. Up, then down, left, then right. In any direction you choose, really. Long as you get from multiple different edges to get all sorts of grooves that are possibly there that you can't even see. Overall, your goal here is to flatten out the surface area. Once we finish sanding, we now move on to the primer side of things. First, test your nozzle and everything. Make sure it sprays. You'd like it to go evenly throughout the process. Long strokes, full on sweeping motion. You can go slowly. I was shooting back and forth pretty quickly because who gives a shit? I already knew that the sanding work wasn't good enough. And you want to make sure that you have your finger kind of like a gun. That is the level of length that you want between the nozzle and your surface area. If you spray too far off, you don't get enough on, you're wasting paint. You get too close, you overspray, and it becomes runny. 30 minutes later, we go at it again. I say for the primer, you only need 2 coats, tops. Then once you finish your 2 coats, I'd say hitting the primer, maybe flattening it out a little bit, smoothing the edges, maybe hit it at around, probably 400 grit sandpaper. And after you've sanded it down at 400 grit or so, without stripping away down to the bare sort of plastic, like as long as you don't go completely through the primer, at least I don't, then you can move on to the first layer of paint, which will be, in my case, the base coat. This will only apply to anyone doing something that has a base and a top coat. If you are only doing something that isn't a 3-stage paint or whatever, you only need to do your one color. So let's say you're doing like a blue or black or whatever, green. Then you just hammer this sucker off, let it dry, do a second coat, and then 30 minutes later, do a clear coat. But since we're doing a 3-stage, we're hitting the base coat, which is white. And then from the white, we check to make sure if it's any good. Now, in some instances, depending on how your work has turned out, you may want to wet sand at 600 or 800 grit sandpaper. Nothing too crazy, nothing too edgy. It's pretty much the same fundamentals as I showed you previously with sanding before primering or sanding while primering. Once it's good and smooth or whatever you choose it to be, like there's no rough edges and it has a more like spray gun feel, you can move on to your next color. Usually I do 2 bases of white in this case, and then I move on to the top coat. Everything happens in 30-minute intervals. Now that we've already got the top coat on, we're moving towards what I usually do. This is me personally. I wet sand at around 800 grit. Usually you wet down the sandpaper. In this case, I decided to do something totally different and retarded. I don't know why. I guess I was feeling odd that day. And while sanding, you don't need to go crazy. Don't ham-fist it. Don't push it down. Don't really get into it, because then you'll scratch everything like crazy. You just want to do enough to where you're actually smoothing out any sort of abrasions or ripples in the paint. The overall goal is to make it a flat surface. You can just let it sit and dry, or you could go over it with like a napkin to soak up some of the damp areas to speed it along. But still, you got to let it sit and dry anyway. You just can't take it right out of there after you've soaked up all the moisture with a napkin. I figured there was no point in doing a video showing me putting on the clear coat, because essentially the clear coat or top coat is exactly the same as painting normally. In my case, I let the paint wait 5 days for the paints I'm using. They're urethane paint versus enamel. Enamel paints sort of cure quicker. I think you can go at them within 24 to 48 hours, but with urethane paint, I wait 5 days before I begin the final wet sanding. While wet sanding at this stage, I go from 1000 grit to 1500 to 2000 to 3000 grit sandpaper finally. The process is much the same as before. You're not going crazy, you're just smoothing out any sort of ripples in the paint. That's it. And you'll notice what you're dealing with at this point when you can hold up your piece to the light and you can see the sort of reflection there. It gives you an idea of what it's going to look like when it's completely finished. After you finish sanding down your piece and you're happy with the coverage you've got, once you consider yourself done, let's put it that way, you then move on to the rubbing compound. In this case, I'm using Meguiar's. There's a whole multitude of stuff you can use. I hear the 3mm version or 3M version is the best currently, so I might try that one day. Also, the clear coat I used on this went bad, and the Meguiar's I'm using has also gone bad, so this is all old stuff. If you have anything new, the outcome will probably be far superior to what you're seeing here. And pretty much after this, it's very simple. It's a good old-fashioned buff. You know, just buff it out. That's all you got to do. Scrub it as best you can, or just work it into the piece as best you can. But not to go too far gone, because then you could strip right through the clear coat that was left after your sanding into the paint and rip that right off. It's happened before, so I figured I'd let you know it's a possibility. But give it a good old-fashioned buff. If you've got like a buffer machine, that would probably go way better than doing it by hand. But since the one I have kind of throws the buffing rag off, I don't use it because it's a good way of ruining everything you've done. I've also found the buffing compound kind of works on the little EVGA logo, surprisingly. Oh, and an extra tidbitted note that I noticed about this. When I removed my masking tape on the little silver piece, it, like the brushed metal that was there, obviously is fake, so it ripped right off with the masking tape, surprisingly. So keep that in mind if you're dealing with a graphics card shroud like this. Probably in your case you won't have that issue, and frankly it's not too bad. In fact, it's perfectly fine if you look at it. What little scratches it did sustain you can't really check out on camera. If this does bother you, you can move on to using some sort of vinyl. Taking a simple vinyl strip, cutting everything to your desired length, and replacing the overall look. This isn't exactly necessary. It could be something you might want to look into, or if you want to add your own accents, using vinyl is a strong possibility. Maybe I'll do a video doing a complete vinyl wrap on a graphics card, see how that goes, and I'll also try vinyl paint later on. As you can see, I'm showing where I made mistakes, but the razor blades I have on hand aren't sharp enough, and if I go too deep on it, I'd only cut through the paint and ruin everything I was working on anyway. And that is that. At this point, you're pretty much done, except for some nitpicking on your end. I know I nitpick my own work repeatedly. You can add pinstriping to your graphics card if you so choose, if you feel like it. If not, to hell with it. And the overall finished piece actually isn't bad. Keep in mind that when putting together these sort of shroud-based graphics cards for the reference design, that sometimes the metal part of the graphics card will rip right through your paint because you have to really jam it in place. It's a real fuck nut, but what can you do, right? And you might say to yourself, what the hell does Gunn know about painting? Well, I paint motorcycle crap, and I figured I'd try to apply some stuff to a graphics card. And in all honesty, this came out very poorly, in my personal opinion, and there is no one to blame but myself for not choosing a better sandpaper to begin with, or trying a more simpler approach as far as plastic primer for painting. But oh well, you know, live, learn. I wanted to see what would happen if I just took a few hours out of my day to try this, let it cure, and then finish it off and let the chips fall where they may. Well, that's going to do it for me. Don't forget to rate, comment, subscribe if you so choose to. Please forgive the fact that there hasn't been any Witcher videos in the past 3 weeks, actually, I've noticed. I've been a little bit more busy than usual. I apologize for that. I didn't expect this sort of thing to happen. Witcher videos will be coming up very soon. It's just the sore throat that I have right now. I don't want to talk for prolonged periods, which is kind of what I do with Witcher videos, if you haven't noticed. And thank you for your time. I'll catch you later. Adios, bichachos. Oh, follow me on social media if you so choose to and desire. That way, those big companies, they have no choice but to notice the main man. I'm like a young Howard Stern, upsetting all sorts of people.